African flags have been flying over in China's Tiananmen Square. Leaders of African nations have been greeted by dancers, honor guards, and children waving flags. They have been escorted in extensive motorcades, past banners celebrating a shared future for China and Africa, and a giant, elaborate flower arrangement. This is China's Africa outreach. Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. These two telling images speak volumes of China's long-term vision to increase its foothold across the world, particularly in the global south and in Africa. Mao did it, and now you see Xi Jinping repeating the same. From the leadership of the global south to the Africa outreach, China's presence in Africa is not a new story. China has pulled out all the stops for a gathering of leaders and top officials from more than 50 African nations in Beijing. Welcoming them with ceremonial splendor, China choreographed in a manner that projects a meeting of the equals.
非洲有句言语，同路人才是真朋友。现代化道路上，一个都不能少。一国都不能掉队。让我们凝聚起28亿多中非人民的磅礴力量，在现代化征程上携手同行，以中非现代化助力全球南方现代化，绘就人类发展史上崭新画卷，共同推动世界走向和平、安全、繁荣、进步的光明前景。
From the global south to the Africa outreach, India has done it, but look at where China began and where it is at today. To discuss a little more on this, I'm being joined by former BBC editor and China analyst Howard Zhang. Howard, thank you so much for joining us here on India.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the pictures. There are two pictures, telling images of how China has looked at the global south, particularly the African continent. The outreach began long ago. The vision does not confine itself to mere 5 years or a political career of one leader, but it goes beyond. And that's quite telling in the images that we've just shown.
Yeah, I posted the two pictures. Essentially wanted to have people think about the comparison between the 1960s all the way till now, over the past few decades. And back in the 1960s, at that time, under the communist leader Mao Zedong, China was primarily preoccupied with winning international friends because China was essentially isolated and by both the US side, the Western allies, as well as later on the Soviet Union and India. So China was almost alone as a country. So Mao looked to the likes of Africa, Middle East, Latin America for support. And they used foreign aid as well as supported what they called anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist struggles. They gave weapons and armed some guerrillas all over the world. In today's terms, people would look at that as a troublemaker type of status. And later on, of course, when China had another leader called Deng Xiaoping after Mao died, he decided to slow down this kind of global south approach. He took a more open the market and be friends with the West type of approach. and that led to the economic boom. And but later on, of course, we saw another shift over the past 10, 15 years. Again, China has started to go further into Africa, to Middle East and Southeast Asia, and especially after the trade war with the US and now cooling relations with the West, you see China now spending billions and trying to woo African nations and trying to get new market for its product, because it's getting less and less investment and sales from the Western countries. So I'm putting the two pictures, essentially trying to say, sometimes history do go in circles. Of course, I have to say the context is quite different now. China was a completely isolated country back in Mao's time and poor. And now China is isolated in some ways, but still got some money. So there's some difference.
Xi Jinping is trying to cast himself as a country defending the developed world and pushing the West to listen to voices of the developing world. But is that really the truth, and is that reality? Billed as Beijing's biggest diplomatic event in years, the representatives of more than 50 African countries are attending the tri-annual forum. The three-day forum is meant to demonstrate Beijing's global clout despite rising tensions with the West. Xi's courtship of African countries is part of a great geopolitical competition with the United States that has intensified in recent years over Russia's war in Ukraine and China's aggressive posturing when it comes to Taiwan and the entire South China Sea. At the forum, the Chinese president pledged to create at least 1 million jobs in Africa, as he sought to position Beijing as the development partner of the choice for the global South. Speaking at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, Xi said that China would provide African countries 360 billion won or $51 billion in new financing and support 30 infrastructure projects to boost connectivity across the continent. He further added that 210 billion won or $29.6 billion of the financing would be disbursed through credit lines, and at least 70 billion yuan or $9.9 billion will be given as new investment by Chinese companies, with smaller amounts provided through military aid and other projects. Also, the difference in how countries perceived Africa. There was a time, or the global South, Howard, there was a time when they were only looked at to reach out to them to see whether they can cause trouble, work with rebels, cause rebellion, revolts. Now, Africa is geostrategically very important. So every nation, every country, every region is looking at Africa to have their foothold. And we do see that China has made inroads into that continent and has had a presence in the continent for quite some time now. In fact, if we talk about first movers advantage, China does have a certain amount of first movers advantage. Would you agree?
China has definitely had a long history in terms of dealing with Africa. If you look at the first aid to Africa was back in, if I didn't remember correctly, it was 1960, over 60-some million US dollars to Egypt. That was the initial first aid. At that time, the sums cannot compare with today, but China had always used a tactic, what many would describe as an elite capture. They offered free scholarships for young African leaders, and African leaders' children, many of them studied in China. And so China has spent a few generations trying to foster a deeper relationship. And over the past 2 decades, China had expanded its footprint in Africa significantly, not only building railways and motorways, stadiums, and even small cities. So now, and I was looking at the export data, China's export to Africa it's actually ramping up quite rapidly compared to the flatlining of export to Europe and America. To Africa, it's actually, but it's still relatively small. But so you can see the dividends. Maybe it's paying a little bit.
Beijing's plans to expand ties with the continent comes amid debt trap accusations. Over the last 2 decades, China has forged deep economic ties with countries in sub-Saharan Africa. According to IMF data, China buys 1/5 of the region's metals, minerals, and fuel, and provides most of manufactured goods from China and machinery imported by African countries, making it the region's largest single country trading partner. But the balance of trade favors China. There are many countries in Africa that continue to seek credit from China despite the heavy debt burden. Kenya is an example. At the forum, President William Ruto hoped to get funding to finish a railway line from the Rift Valley to Malaba town on Kenya's western border with Uganda. He also was looking for more investment to build roads and dams and set up an industrial park for pharmaceutical companies. Let's now talk about the Chinese debt trap. You just spoke about $60 million back then to $50 billion today. The countries that are looking at support, financial aid, are actually looking at Beijing. But does that come with a trap? Does that come with riders that could cost them heavily should they take that help from China?
There are two sides to it. And the international criticism, of course, of the Chinese investment in Africa, as well as in Latin America and Southeast Asia, is that this is potentially a debt trap for some of the governments, especially when the government is suffering from corruption. One of the cases often raised is Sri Lanka. They had to cede one of their ports built by China to China for 99 years. So there was a lease, and there were lots of those instances. But at the same time, the criticism from more subdued criticism from within China, from within Chinese society, is more about why is the government wasting all these billions? Because the government had to, the Beijing government had to essentially forgive billions of debts because none of those countries can afford to ever repay after the COVID, especially. And as I remember, it was earlier this year, the Prime Minister of China announced to forgive 11 billion, I think, worth of foreign debt. So those are the scale of waste many in China see. At the same time, when unemployment, especially youth unemployment, it's going through the roof, and the government had to stop giving public data now. They no longer publish youth unemployment data because it's so high. And we all know about property bubble bursting, and lots of people are trapped in debt within the country. So many people quietly are asking, so we need help, and we're struggling. We have, our own family to feed. Why are you giving all these billions to African countries to help them build their country while we have nothing? That's the two sides of, I guess, this.
But how do they have that voice? How many people are actually protesting the economic downturn in China? I know that there is a lot of activity happening in Chinese social media and the Chinese chatter that we sometimes pick up. But how significant is that chatter? How significant is that revolt on social media, so to say?
It's essentially manifested at this moment on social media chatters. If you go to, first of all, for audience who may not know, the Chinese media landscape is almost 100% completely controlled by the government, and the government is controlled by one party, the Communist Party. Hence, you cannot really publish anything or say anything that contradicts the government's, line of events and narrative. But at the same time, lots of people have gotten used to this fact, and they use, sometimes euphemism, sometimes they crack jokes, or they bring up historical events and trying to, make people see parallels. That's why I brought up a two picture to sort of, did not put too much words, albeit I'm overseas. I'm not under the control of anybody. But it's the same style. I think I see sometimes on Chinese social media is how people tell a story. And so behind those two pictures, you can tell the story of back then, during Mao's era, people were starving. People like today's North Korea were starving and they had no money, but Mao had money to give to friends in Africa and Asia and Latin America.
Very interesting point.
Yeah. And today, the same thing. Many people are not doing that well, especially all those tens of millions of people whose houses are not built, but they still have to pay their mortgage because they bought off plan. And then the company gone bankrupt. IBM just stopped their operation in China and 1,000 people got laid off just last week. There were things happening. Imagine those IBM employees used to make a Western salary, living in China, having a good living standard. And overnight, if they have a mortgage, they're in deep trouble. And those people would be looking at the government and say, okay, you have no help for me, but you have help for everybody else. And that's, a sentiment, prevailing sentiment among quite a number of people now in China.
Okay, that's a very interesting comparison that you make from Mao's times to now, where there still is a lot of economic struggle for the people of China, but China still makes space, economic space, to give away money to other countries. Having said that, strategically speaking, Howard, there is a give and take. There is a quid pro quo over here. When China gives aid to a particular country, keep the Chinese debt trap aside, where they are taking massive returns in terms of the interest rates. That aside, they also make sure that the countries are obligated to send stuff to China, which again becomes the exports from and buy from China. So the exports from China are going to these countries. The infrastructure projects that are there go to China. And they earn from that. So there's a lot of quid pro quo. They manage to then arm twist these countries into doing things Beijing's way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very apparent soft power push. And the point I'm trying to make is many people, even within China, are doubting the cost attached to this push. And, all countries do, from Washington, D.C. to London to Delhi to every big country want to have more international influence, want, better kind of openings to future market and more access to their own industries. And so all these things are normal. The trouble is, if you look at the size of these so-called investment or debt givings in Africa compared to the level of impoverishment and rising unemployment in China, many people do feel there is a bit of an imbalance. But the thing is, in India, people can go onto the street and protest. In the West, people can actually write articles and say something and go protest. But in China, they can only have a few jokes on, small social media circles and nobody.
Well, it's not just the accusations of debt burden or debt trap levied against China, where Beijing will provide the financing and support infrastructure projects to boost connectivity across the continent. China might also look at expanding its military presence in that very same region. According to reports, Africa is host to a rising number of foreign military operations and bases, largely due to bilateral agreements between African Union member states and foreign powers. Of the 13 countries with a known presence in Africa, the United States and France have the most troops on the continent. According to French Ministry of Defense, France has an estimated 7,550 military personnel spread across the continent in various military operations and missions, while the US has a higher number spread across 34 known outposts across northern, western, and Horn regions of Africa. The Horn of Africa has become the epicenter of this presence with about 11 foreign military bases. This is largely due to the region's strategic proximity to Asia and West Asia and the subsequent threats along the Red Sea. Well, the increasing presence of Asian powers in Djibouti points to another major risk. Following China's expanding presence in the country, there are growing fears in Japanese and Indian circles regarding Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean. The result? Expansion of Japanese influence in Djibouti. This has not just exported tensions in the East China Sea to Africa, but has also made Africa practically complicit in the actions of its guests elsewhere. Now take, for example, the role of Djibouti as a base for US drone operations in Somalia and Yemen, as well as what the UAE is doing in the use of Assab base in Eritrea for operations in Yemen. The rivalry between US and China is playing out in Djibouti. Apart from turning Africa into a proxy turf for extra-regional competition, the risks of such tensions escalating are high. In such situations, the host member states and Africa in general are set to house the showdown and will be on the receiving end of the ensuing destruction. The strategic aspect of things, Howard.
Yeah.
We're talking about not just the economic stranglehold, but also the Chinese strategic stranglehold in the African continent and the global south, if you want to broad base it a little. How China has managed to ensure that they not only with their financial aid, their influence in these countries, have a say on the economic decisions that these countries take, but also strategic decisions like allowing naval bases, military bases.
Absolutely.
Massive presence of various countries, but more so now of China than any other country?
Well, if you talk about absolute scale of things, China is still very small in terms of overseas stationing of navy or army, tiny. And there is a little bit of in the Horn of Africa, I think there's only one naval stop. They were talking about Sri Lanka. I'm not sure if that's even happening. There could be something in Cambodia. So it's still tiny compared to the massive presence of the US. You know, some European powers, France and UK, have overseas stations. And so in terms of, if we compare these powers, China is tiny in that sense, the presence. But at the same time, there's no denying, by reaching out to these African countries, especially, you know, you read literatures from the Xi Jinping government's policies, they are making it quite frank. They're in a competition with the West. They believe they're on the right track, and China is, and the East, what they call is rising, and the West, the capitalist West, is declining. And hence he's taken a pro-Russia, pro-Putin, and pro-Iran, pro-Hamas, and he wants any force to join him to challenge the current world order. So that is a given. And he is getting, friendly, I guess, comebacks from the likes of Latin American countries such as Brazil, Venezuela, and he's making lots of friends. Now you can see on the pictures, and in all the major African countries are in Beijing. And so in that sense, yes, geopolitically, he's making waves. But whether in the long run, these waves will translate again into sustainable influences. And, that's a big question mark, because China, relatively, again, the economy is not faltering. And domestically is experiencing trouble. So whether that can be sustained, that's the question.
Also, can Xi Jinping sustain leadership in the country? That also is a big question. But before I come to that, it is an entire Western bloc versus China. If we look at the presence, they have a vast presence because they're a massive group. But that's the threat perception of China today, that an entire region, an entire block of nations have to come together to counter China. There is no alternative to the Chinese supply chain. They're still looking for one. The countries that have anything to offer also third-party source it from China. So right now, at this juncture, at this point in time, Howard, China still remains an indispensable force, whether we like it or not, to a certain extent.
Well, it's true to a degree, but the trend, if you just look at the trend of whether we like the term or not, decoupling is happening. And especially after COVID, after nearly 3 years, China, the authoritarian government decided without any scientific proof that they wanted to lock the country down and deny the world their supply chain. And that sent a shock wave all around the world. I think in many board rooms all around the world in top companies, people had to take that into consideration. And many companies, even the ones that they're called the China panda huggers or the China lovers, decided, even Apple, for example, who's got a huge stake, are slowly now moving some of their production lines to India for exactly the same reason.
Vietnam, yes, they are. Okay, and finally, before I let you go, just because we're talking about military over here, one of the biggest news that has rattled the NATO military bloc, is the fact that Turkey is now applying for membership within the BRICS, which is primarily, while it is Brazil, Russia, India, China, or South Africa, the fact that it is a China-Russia bloc itself should rattle the West, and Turkey is just doing that.
Yeah, there was I saw a survey online and put up at one of the economic magazines asking, what's your take on Turkey applying for BRIC membership? Whether it's trying to sit on the fence and choose eventually the winning side, or is trying to diversify its future fortunes. And there's a number of questions. For me, I think Turkey, especially under the current leader Erdogan, has also demonstrated clearly its regional leadership intentions. And it was not wholly happy with lots of the old order of things. And it's looking for things ways to change things, vis-a-vis regional security, its own regional ambitions. It felt spurned by the EU not granting them the accession negotiations. There were lots of things happening, and they even tried to buy Russian missile and Chinese missiles. And that also, so you can see seeds of division between Turkey and NATO other members. And I guess in the long run, this is playing, I would say investment terms, is trying to straddle both sides. That's more of my thinking, because China and Russia, as some of the countries are not very happy with the Pax Americana, or the American-led world order, are looking to first deleverage from trading with the West only, and trying to form some type of a currency union where they can trade without using the US dollar. That's a big push. And maybe Turkey sees something in it. Maybe that will help them to become leader in the Middle East in the long run, when the petrodollar, when the oil dollar eventually wanes, or somebody foresees that. And that's my observation, of course. But history will tell whether Turkey's decision to put some distance between itself and its traditional allies, and now having new friends, is the smart one.
China has officially asserted that it does not see Africa as a region where major powers compete for geopolitical gains. It has regularly insisted that it is interested in working with the region towards the so-called win-win cooperation. And such meetings are a way for Beijing to demonstrate China's commitment to Africa. But reality shows something else. It shows that China is invested in Africa for geopolitical reasons, geostrategic reasons, and for the competition with the West. How is West going to look at these meetings, these summits, is something we'll have to see in the coming days. Thank you for watching India Today Global.